Sacred Traditions program honoring the feast day of Sangó. I am Melody Capote, Executive Director of the organization. Many of you know us as CCCADI or CCCADI, and we welcome you if you're new to our program, and we welcome you back if you're part of our family. The Center's work has focused on advancing cultural equity, racial and social justice for African descendants worldwide throughout our 45-year history. We encourage you to visit our website at cccadi.org to follow our programs and to make a donation. One of the essential components of our work is the spirituality line of our programming, the way that we are responsible in accurately portraying these sacred traditions. And as we prepare for this evening's performance, we have taken great care to focus on the journey that has been presenting El Nuevo Oro last year, which focused on the Lukumi tradition. With the presentation today by Michael Manswell and Something Positive and this journey to Trinidad, we will highlight the Sangó Baptist tradition, where once again we will see similarities and differences, but in general, really take the time to honor the owner of the drum, the owner of lightning and thunder, the owner of the world, as we celebrate Sangó. Thank you for being with us. We are joined today by Michael Manswell, Artistic Director of Something Positive, who's not only a dear friend, but one with whom we've had a very long relationship. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much, Mel. It is indeed a pleasure.
Tell us a little bit about who you are, talk about the company, and let's give folks like the history we have. It's been a long relationship, about 40 years that we've been working together.
A wonderfully long relationship, much more than pleasant. We are now family. My name is Michael Manswell. I am the Artistic Director of Something Positive Incorporated. This company was founded by Cheryl Byron a long time ago. I don't want to date myself, but we are basically the keepers of that flame of a Caribbean identity via performance, storytelling, theater, dance, music, poetry, and it's been a few years since Cheryl has gone, but after she left and transitioned, I became the artistic director. I'm also a professor of dance at Lehman College, and I have thoroughly enjoyed that part of it. But I've also worked very closely with other community organizations. Medgavis College, Caribbean Cultural Center, EM Techniques, Pure Elements, Abundance, teaching, doing the work that I think that cultural torchbearers should do.
And it's the preservation of our culture.
Absolutely, absolutely, right. Because if not us, who?
Exactly.
And I've found out in the recent years that when we stop having the conversations inside of the community, there is an abundance of ignorance. And I get people saying, oh really, that happened, yes. And so the students, it has to be continuous. And I applaud the work of the Caribbean Cultural Center, who are indefatigable as far as that is concerned. So thank you very much.
The major role of the center has been around the tradition is how we have been able to preserve it, document it, and portray it, right? We've finally been able to kind of come out of the closets and come out of the basements with this tradition. And it is the work of our founder, Marta Moreno Vega, who really has taken the effort, made great strides in portraying this religion or these traditions accurately. And so as we prepare to celebrate the feast day of Sangó, we thought immediately of you and the company, because as part of our goal in traveling the diaspora and looking at the journey and looking back to move forward, we wanted to focus on Trinidad and the Sangó Baptist traditions. as one of the places, right, one of the stops where enslaved Africans were brought and, in fact, did all of this work to preserve the tradition. So I thank you for bringing something positive to the stage with us again this year.
You are most welcome.
And now we are going to take a moment to look at a presentation we did with Something Positive back in 2015. Although we have a very long relationship in our work with the company, this will bring us the most current work, and we can talk a little bit more about how we will celebrate Sangó this year. Thank you. I remember this show was actually 2015, just before I initiated.
Wow.
So I was really excited
Wow.
by this presentation. Do you remember?
I remember this very clearly because preparing for this was an education for all the dancers and the singers, and I actually had to translate so much of it into English for them. And this Oya is fabulous.
It sure is. This presentation was, I think we had a group we had Something Positive representing Trinidad.
Yes.
We had a Brazilian group.
Yes.
And I want to say probably a Cuban group.
Cuban group, yes,
right?
certainly.
So here we have Oya, one of the wives of Sangó, who we're celebrating with
The
today's
principal wife of Sangó.
Want to talk a little bit about?
But in this is a very theatricalized version, but Oya is the fierce warrior that stands by the side of Sangó. On the back of her costume, you'll see lightning bolts glittering.
Right, yes.
Yeah, that was a Cheryl thing. Yes, that was a Cheryl thing. Yes. And so she is very decorated. In Trinidad, the color for Oya is principally green.
Okay.
Yeah,
and
not the coppery, the brown.
blue.
Yes, much like the African, the Cuban is much more like the African than the Trinidad coloration. But the color green for Oya is used to symbolize leaves that flutter, because Oya is represents the only element that you cannot see.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's the only, and here comes,
Uh-oh, there he
here,
comes.
here he comes.
There's Sangó.
Yes.
So we know, I mean, again, as we're presenting this year's tribute, we talk about the attributes and the similarities in all of these traditions and also some of the differences.
Absolutely.
So we know Sangó to be the owner of the drum, right? Represented also by thunder.
And lightning.
You have his
Oshe.
You have his Oshe. And I understand reading some of the patakis, some of the legends that we learned through the tradition.
Yes.
That Sangó is the one born with war on his head.
On his head.
On his head.
On his head. And as a result, that's why the Oshe is also represented on his headpiece. But in Trinidad and Tobago, he's also the one who assures victory in areas where you may not necessarily find yourself advocating for yourself. Sangó Kabiyesi advocates for you. So oftentimes he's thought of as the attorney of the orishas, the silver-tongued one.
I've heard that.
The one who can sell cotton to the makers of cotton.
Okay.
He will take sand to the beach and sell it to the beach. He has that ability, that charm, and elegance.
Well, that's really interesting because everyone kind of refers to him. And the more I read and learn about the various orishas, the attributes, the strength, we know him to be the warrior, the fighter.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And yet, very little is ever spoken of the other side that he represents.
And the warrior part of it is a kind of subtle, strategic warriorship that is, you see this personage, but then there's this wonderful smile. And the more, like you, the more I read about Shango, I realize that Ogun is the primal, but Shango is the palace.
Oh, that's right. I like that.
Yes,
I like
yes,
that.
yeah. And so we don't give anything to Shango, we don't offer anything to Shango unless it's under the cover of a house. Nothing is done outside as far as Ebo to Shango. It's always done
Interesting.
inside because
Okay.
he's the palace god. Yes, he's the deity of the palace.
Well, there he goes with his
Yes, with his wife. Delightful.
Again, the fact that we wanted to take this moment in celebrating, you know, the center has done maybe 30 years in celebrating Shango. And if I say his name and let me lift up because from Capote. Our history together, our relationship with Something Positive is one that has really been part of that journey, right?
Certainly.
I think even to say that when there wasn't a stage, there wasn't a platform for these traditions to be highlighted, you know, you along with many of the others who were doing this work kind of in pockets and in places where, you know, you might not otherwise even be seen.
Exactly.
We then found a place, right? You found a
Absolutely.
place at the center, you found a home, and we too still would have ideas and thoughts about how to do this, and always with the sensitivity of wanting to be certain that we were doing these portrayals correctly.
Exactly.
So we had folks around us, John Mason,
John Mason.
Robert Farris Thompson, Ibaye,
Ibaye.
Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, Angela Fontanes, Danny Dawson, we were talking about Danny Dawson earlier. Just kind of always assuring that the way we portrayed these traditions, whether in conversation or the visuals, that we were on point, right? We wanted to not be disrespectful, and we also wanted to assure that the information we were sharing with audiences was correct. So for the many folks who follow us and the family that follows the center for many years, we're grateful. But for the new audience, right, and the new interests, even,
And there is a renewed interest.
there's a renewed interest in a lot of what has been the traditional music, the tradition that is sacred, the sacred or spirituality line of the work that we do. And we want to continue to be that source that provides the information in the right context. And so I wanted to speak a little bit about the Sangó Baptist tradition in particular, because as we have on a stage, as we saw in Lincoln Center, we had Cuba, Brazil, and Trinidad represented. When we've done this tribute to Sangó last year, we focused on the Lukumi tradition and in fact highlighted a group we called La Nueva Generación, the new generation of practitioners, of drummers, of singers in this practice. And so we traveled now from Cuba and Lukumi to what is then the Sangó Baptist tradition in Trinidad. So you want to speak a little bit to us about?
Sure.
About
I want to remind you, 1996 was the first time I did this with the center with Cheryl. 1996. And I'll never forget, we talked about it sometime in like the summer, like August, and then it was like, oh, we're not gonna do it again. And Cheryl was like, what? Oh, no, Marta, you can't not do it. And so we worked so hard, and actually, it formed, and it was an impetus for us first to create costumes that clearly delineated the qualities of these orisha, of these deities that we love. And so it's so interesting that, you know, we're still doing that. We're still doing that. And according to some of the Nigerian Babalaos, one of the reasons why the Sangó Baptist tradition is called Sangó Baptist is because, according to them, they say this jokingly, that Sangó stepped in Trinidad first before he stepped in Nigeria.
Okay.
And so the reason why it's called Sangó Baptist is because, interestingly enough, we think of, and this is some of the things that we've always continued to seek to write, correct, position well with our young people and people who are new to the tradition, that many of the Yoruba people that came to Trinidad and Tobago were not enslaved. Many of them. Some were, but many of them were not. And in the 1840s, in the Yoruba-Igbo wars fought in Oyo, the Yoruba lost. And so there was an option. You're either going to stay here and be under the Igbos, or you're going to go to the colonies. Choose one. And so a lot of them chose Trinidad and Tobago. And they came to Trinidad as free people, as free Africans. And they set up enclaves inside of Trinidad and Tobago. And yes, it is. And we think, and it's borne out by some of the scholarship by people like Maureen Warner Lewis, etc., that the vibrancy of the practice is borne out because it was not done under the cover of darkness or secrecy. But there was a lot more freedom of expression at that point, just before the turn of the century, halfway into the 19th century, that Yoruba people could practice in a certain way.
I love that.
Yes.
I don't know that that's ever, I know that I've ever heard that, but I don't know if it's actually been said that we could hear.
Yes,
that free
yes.
Africans had that choice.
Yes,
right?
and there were enclaves of free Africans all over the island of Trinidad specifically. And J.D. Elder mentions that in he calls it the paper on the Yoruba cult in Gasparillo, which is southern Trinidad. But there were also those in northern Trinidad. In fact, where I'm from, Diego Martin, Spanish, there is a place called Sierra Leone. Yes, it's called Sierra Leone. Why? Because, as you know, in 1807, the British eliminated slave trade. Trading in Africans was prohibited. So anybody found on the high seas with Africans in their holds were taken to Sierra Leone, and all those Africans on those ships were free. Some of those people eventually chose to come to Trinidad. And so they set up enclaves, and they called that place Sierra Leone because that's where some of them remembered that they were coming from, not necessarily that they were necessarily from Sierra Leone, but that's where they found themselves because they were then free.
So when we look at, there are a few points you've raised in saying that, when we look at the tradition and the way it's been practiced throughout the diaspora, right? We get a lot of, in my house, we do this. In my house, we do it that way. You're not doing that correctly.
Yes.
We know that enslavement and the fact that our folks were dispersed throughout the world, there's no one that's practicing this tradition in its purest form, right? We all have tried to rescue it and to preserve it. We understand through the work of the center even where there are commonalities, the things that we share, and of course the things that are different. Can you speak a little bit about that? For example, we were talking earlier and I mentioned to you Elegua, and you said, no, we don't have Elegua in Trinidad.
No.
Can you talk a little bit about what some of those differences are?
Certainly, and I want to go back to what you're saying about the differences. My visits to Africa via initiation, I am a Babalawo initiated. I am not a Babalawo by hard training. I am still in training, and it is lifelong.
And we're always learning.
Yes, and it's lifelong. You realize that even in the motherland where this tradition birthed itself, everybody does it differently. And so you get those from Ijesha, you get those from Abeokuta, you get those from Oyo, Ibadan, so on, and everyone has a different approach. So this approach that's different, that we see the differences, I think because the world has shrunk via the internet and because we're doing scholarship, Altar of My Soul, Maureen Warner Lewis, J.D. Elder, Molly Ahiba, who done John Mason and they pull these so-called differences or similarities, together. We realize, okay, it might be different, but same old. We're gonna do that. And so sometimes we need to just like back down from that. And that whole idea of Elegua. So for example, language is a dynamic thing. It's constantly changing and growing. So Elegua comes from Elegbara, Elegba, Haiti, Legba, right? Are we gonna say, oh, it's not that? No, we sit back, we look, we learn, we understand. And Elegua, because of the Spanish, the way the Spanish syntax is, Elegbara became Elegua. In Trinidad, because
We are British, so we think. So, well, we're English speaking, largely. Eshu, because it's coming out of that Nigeria, almost like a direct Nigerian pronunciation. Eshu is Eshu. So we did not have Elegoa. But the function, the same. And so in our practice, and I always found this so lovely when I would go to a Bembe for Lukumi people, they would start singing for Elegoa, and it's always first, they use red and black. I'm like, okay, same. And so one thing I do counsel people when I talk to them, there is this common thread. There is no difference. One of my students once asked me, so how does Oya dance in Trinidad? I said, same as she dances in Cuba and the same as she dances in Nigeria. I see no difference because I truly haven't seen a difference. Truly have not seen a difference.
You speak to that, but I also noticed that there are kind of these elements of each orisha that tend to carry over.
Yes.
And so when we were looking at Oya, and we're comparing her to the Oya you might see in the Lukumi tradition, or even in Oshun, who I know for us is usually gold or yellow, and in Trinidad you tend to use pink and other colors that
pink
go.
and blue, pink and white.
Can you speak a little bit more about why that difference, or is there really not a big difference?
I personally, when I have looked at it, Oya, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago is green. And the color green refers to the fact that she's called the trembler of leaves. It's the only, Oya represents the only element in nature that you cannot see and or touch, but you can feel. And so the only time you know that, the only time you know that Oya is there is when the trees start trembling and the leaves start trembling. And so she became called, that color then became associated with her, as well as when I looked back at some of the work done by Judith Gleason, she is referred to as the woman from the hills. Molly Ahi always told us that Oya protected Trinidad from storms. Because of our northern range, it's over 3,000 meters or whatever high, 3,000 feet high, and storms, hurricanes can't climb it. It's rare that they climb. So we get hit like every 25 years or something, like some superstorm. But because of that range of hills, and they're very, very green, Oya is thought of as the protector because, Sango lives there.
I love that.
Well, you know Molly. Molly was really absolutely a stunning.
Molly, Pro Primus, Percival Board, and all names that we have to acknowledge as part of this journey, because they've all been such an integral part of the work, all participated at some point with the work of the center. So thank you for bringing up Molly, because we were chatting about her earlier as well. You went from Oya being the protector of Trinidad, and you mentioned where Sango lives.
Where Sango lives.
So I think that brings us
right into
back to our program.
Sangó Baptist.
Yes.
Why is that? In fact, the whole practice in Trinidad was called Sango. The Orisha people, and I'm going to date myself again, in the late 70s, early 80s, before I was fully initiated, if you said you were doing a Sango dance, it didn't mean the dance of Sango. It meant an Orisha presentation. But Sango, because I believe we celebrate Sango on a Friday, it was payday. It was also the culmination of 4 days of feasting, and it led to that. But even before that, the last migrants, African migrants, the last ones that came were the ones from Oyo, the place of Sango. And so that prime mover that Sango was, everybody became Sango, because it was what they were known to be. But also Sango the charmer. Sango the beautiful one, Sango the one with many women, the one that people fall down for the powerful one, the one with many wives, etc., etc. And so we moved towards that. But also here came what I would call the Christianization, partly because of the syncretism of it all, Baptists that were coming from the United States, coming from London, and forming this, what I would call a shell, but also infusing the practice. Because of course, as you lose language that we just spoke about, now we have English, and practices start blending. And who's to say what is to survive? Only the practice decides what will survive. And so this melding gave these Sangó orisha practitioners a way to conform to some degree, because there were these Baptists, the tremblers, going into some form of manifestation. And so here we have this blending, and we started to be called Sangó Baptist. When I joined the tradition, there was a move because of Black power in the United States that we started calling ourselves orisha worshippers, or orisha people. And that was, I want to say, 79, 80, somewhere along there, when we started to feel the effects of the whole Black power and Black resistance and Black knowledge and Africanisms. People were becoming more aware, and therefore they were putting those into practice. And therefore you became known as Sangó Baptist, because you tread both places. A Christianized version, much like the Oludara churches.
Exactly.
And as well as that African, very, very African tradition. So really and truly, the purity that people talk about really doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. And I don't think it has ever existed. People practiced as it was presented to them, as it was needed.
And as they could.
Yes.
Right? That's why
because
the
in
syncretism.
Trinidad there's no ochosi. That's not a word I have ever heard.
No ochosi?
No, that I have, maybe now. But no ochosi. Why? It's a small island. Where are we going to have tracts of land like the Amazon to have a tracker? I mean, they're hunters, of course, but not like these huge, vast tracts of land like in Brazil or like in Yoruba land, etc. Or even in Cuba, where Cuba is way bigger than Trinidad.
Right.
And so there was no, even though I am sure ochosi is present, there was no reference because there was no need. You walk for a few hours, you get to one side. Next few hours, you get to the next side.
But that's interesting. You use the because there was no need, or really looking at the need.
The need.
Right? So that we know what we're practicing and why we're practicing.
Exactly. Exactly. But there was a need for Africans to be represented. And what better way than Sangó, Kabiesi, smiling, charmer, powerful, social. Why the social? Dance. You can take that into any arena.
Yes.
Any arena. And if you're a good dancer, like in the French court of the Baroque, you moved up.
Right.
You moved up. Move on up once you're a dancer. And so that whole idea of this charmer, the palace one, the one that's adorned with many brass ornaments. Ala doye, ubalufe, Sangó wale loye, ala doye. The one that is adorned with many brass ornaments lives. And so that whole idea, that's why you see people ask me, how come, African people in Trinidad, like, they have no real place to go, but they're always decked in gold. There are two reasons.
What are the
One reason is we come from a culture of adornment. That's one. Two, that adornment could bail you out of jail. So you go to the pawn shop, you pawn that slave bag, and you're going to get out of jail. So it was an investment in the possibility of and we know that the criminalization of African people existed then, now, and as much as things change, as much as they remain the same. So yes, and then of course, when you walked into the palais, the place of worship, which literally means palace in French,
you had to look good. You had to look like Shango. You had to look fantastic. So your women and your men had to be adorned. It is this adornment that we, and the veneration that we do give to Shango that causes this kind of bubbly. And you realize that a lot of people from Trinidad are always smiling and funny and happy. And I think it is because of this Shango energy.
The energy that lives on the island and lives in all of you.
Yes.
So take us to the presentation that we're about to see this afternoon, this evening.
This evening, because we are in a different space. It's not Lincoln Center, which is 40 by 40. We're going to start with what we call, it's at the beginning of every ceremony, the drummers sit and they play what you would call, is it oro seco?
The oro seco.
Oro. They would do that. It's not called that. We don't know it as that. I don't know even what it's called. The drummers sit, they play. From my point of view as an armchair, social person, is that it changes as an esoteric. It changes the atmosphere. It calls attention. It awakens the air. So we'll have that. We will sing for Eshu.
There he is.
Yes. The one that we must sing for first. And then we will go to Oya, because this wind, this stormy wind, ushers in the energy of Shango, because she is the mistress of change. She is the mistress of the buffeting winds. And I had one Oya friend of mine who would say, all change is good. There's no such thing as bad change. All change is good. It's change. That's what it is. Followed by Shango, Kabisi, who will come in and they will interact and then they will dance together and we'll call that a day. But it is very important to note that for us, there is no one without the other. There is Shango, there is Oya. There's Oya, there's Shango. One, even though they have very strong streams,
Both of them.
very strong streams, they are better together than they are apart. And so Friday morning and Saturday night are dedicated to Shango and Oya. If Shango does not manifest, does not come down in your yard on that night, 40 days from then, you have to do it all over again and ensure that Shango comes to eat his food of fire. He eats the fire. It's exciting to see. And oftentimes, he will be joined by Oya that he will feed, giving that sense of stability, groundedness, that there's no one without the other. The female, the male are all but one.
Well, Michael, thank you. And I want to thank the audience for listening in and joining us today. There's much to be learned every time we speak about this tradition. There's something new that I learned, so I'm sure the viewers do as well. And I'm going to leave you now with Michael Manswell and something positive in our honoring of the feast day of Shango. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Eshubarak bo mojuba. Are shubarak bo mojuba. Atamonde kori eshubarak bo mojuba. Talekba eshulona. Eshubarak bo mojuba. Are shubarak bo mojuba. Atamonde kori eshubarak bo mojuba. Talekba eshulona. Eshubarak bo mojuba, are shubarak bo mojuba, atamonde kori eshubarak bo mojuba, talekba eshulona. So abe shu, so abe alerari wo, so alera baba raba, so alera baba raba, so abe shu, so abe alerari wo. Eswo ibaude, Eswo ibaude, Eswo ibaude, Eswo ibaude, Eswo ibaude, Esuba iroko, Esuba iroko, Esuba iroko, Esuba Esuba. Roko es, ay roko esupa, 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 ay roko esupa. Oya riwo oya oya riwo oya come up tell me oya riwo oya riwo oya riwo de ayaba mawole. Oya o logbo de ayaba mawole. Oya o logbo de ayaba mawole. Oya o logbo de ayaba mawole. Oya o me mariwo, oya o me sakwalo. Oya o i mariwo, oya o i sakwalo. Oya o me mariwo, oya o me sakwalo. Oya o i moroya, moroya. Oya premio. 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 Emi oya ikiti, emi oya mamaja, mama orisha rijaja. Emi oya ikiti. Emi oya mama lorisha rijaja, emi oya ikiti, emi oya ikiti, emi oya mamaja, mama orisha rijaja, emi oya ikiti, emi oya ikiti, emi oya mamaja, mama lorisha rijaja, emi oya ikiti, ye oya, emi oya, ye oya, mama oya, ye oya, mama oya, ye oya, emi oya, emi oya, ye oya, mama oya, ye oya, mama oya, oya o ti lokpo, tani mo lokpo ti lokpe, oya o ti lokpo, tani mo lokpo ti lokpe, oya o ti lokpo, tani mo lokpo ti lokpe, oya o ti lokpo, tani mo lokpo ti lokpe, tani mo lokpo ti lokpe, tani Tanimolopo yawo.
Oya o tilokpo, tanimolope, tilokpe.
Tanimolopo tilokpe, tanimolopo yawo.
Oya o tilokpe, tanimolopo, tilokpe.
Tanimolopo tilokpe, tanimolopo yawo.
Oya o tilokpo, tanimolopo, tilokpe.
Tanimolopo tilokpe, tanimolopo yawo.
Oya o tilokpo, tanimolopo, tilokpe. Sango moju berele. Sango di eri jaja orisha roko erumale. Sango mojuba eile yeah ìwà lọ́pàkúso. Aladoye obalufre Sango woriloye.
Aladoye.
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 Aladoye obalufre Sango woriloye.
Aladoye.
Obalufre Sango woriloye.
Aladoye.
Obalufre Sango woriloye.
Aladoye.
Obalufre Sango woriloye obakuso.
Aladoye.
Obalufre Sango woriloye.
Aladoye.
Obalufre Sango woriloye.
Aladoye.
Obalufre Sango woriloye.
Aladoye. Owaleloye. Aladoye.
Sango baba wa, Sango lodo karele, Sango baba wa olododo kabiyesi o.
Shango Baba wa, Shango loto karele, Shango Baba wa, oloto kabiyesi o.
Sango baba wa, Sango lodo karele, Sango baba wa olododo kabiyesi o.
Shango Baba wa, Shango loto karele, Shango Baba wa, oloto kabiyesi o.
Sango baba wa, Sango lodo karele, Sango baba wa olododo kabiyesi o.
Shango Baba wa, Shango loto karele, Shango Baba wa, oloto kabiyesi o.
Sango baba wa, Sango lodo karele, Sango baba wa olododo kabiyesi o.
Shango Baba wa, Shango loto karele, Shango Baba wa, oloto kabiyesi o. Emi so, emi alado so, anise nise. Emi
Emi alara so
anise nise. Emi so, emi alado so, anise nise.
emi alara so anise nise.
Shango,
Anise nise.
oya o,
Anise nise.
obakoso,
Anise nise.
oya o,
Anise nise.
osuno,
Anise nise.
emonja,
Anise nise.
eshuo,
Anise nise.
oguno.
Anise nise.
Emi so, emi alado so, anise nise.
Emi alara so anise nise.
Emi so, emi alado so, anise nise.
Emi alara so anise nise.
Shango,
Anise nise.
oya o,
Anise nise.
obatala,
Anise nise.
eshu o,
Anise nise.
ogun o,
Anise nise.
erile o,
Anise nise.
emonja,
Anise nise.
osuno.
Anise nise.
Emi so, emi alado so, anise nise.
Emi alara so anise nise.
Emi so, emi alado so, anise nise.
Emi alara so anise nise.
Shango,
Anise nise.
obakuso,
Anise nise.
emonja,
Anise nise.
obatala,
Anise nise.
oya o,
Anise nise.
osaino,
Anise
Oja, Oya o, Obakuso, Emi so, Emi alada so, and he said, Emi alada so, and he said,